Thank you to those of you who have remained. As the afternoon has gone on, we've seen some people kind of make their way out of the room, so thank you for those of you who have stayed. I have the unique privilege, or what I like to call challenge, of finishing the end of the day. All of you guys are eager to kind of get out and explore, especially the MSc students, so bear with me while we talk about a few things. This is actually a nice way to talk about a couple of the pieces we've discussed already. Sheldon at the beginning started off talking about identity, so we're going to talk a bit about that. And Diego just got into a bit about local food systems, and so I'm going to be talking about community gardens, so perhaps some connections that we can draw between those things. I'd like to thank my supervisor, Tina Dason, for her assistance in kind of drafting this project. She's been very supportive and perhaps patient with me, so this is wonderful. And so let's get to it. So first of all, I want you to think about a construct for a second. Who am I? So think to yourself, who am I as a person? It's a bit philosophical perhaps, but this is really what kind of interested me to begin with, and what kind of started off as the key construct in my exploration here. And so personal identity can be defined as a unique sense of self. So I'm a happy person, I'm energetic, I'm an introvert, I'm something. You're considering it internally. But alternatively, it could also be considered as a social identity. So if you're part of a group, you might associate that identification as your own identity. So I'm a PhD student, some of you are MSc students, some of you are professors, right? So you can associate your identity with the group that you are a part of. So there's two different ways to look at that. So if you consider that, think about I am. So who am I, right? Once you've thought about that process, you have to get to the point of discussing, okay, well, what am I? How do I identify myself? What is my identification? So from identification, at least in the case of management literature, we often draw on social identity theory, which essentially says that group is really important. And given that we study organizations, that makes sense. All of us in organizations are part of a group, and that tends to be how we associate our identity, right? I work for a bank. I work for this. I work for that. So you associate, perhaps in a lot of cases as a profession, with the group. So organizational identification, then, is your perception of being connected, although not necessarily physically, to an organization. So if I'm an employee of an organization, it probably forms part of my identity. I used to work for a business development bank in Canada. I said I was a commercial banker when people asked me what I did. That was part of my identity. Please don't hold that against me. With that said, you don't have to be connected to an organization in order to identify with it. You might just believe in some of the ideals. You might think that organization is wonderful and you identify with some of those things. So that's why the bracket, not necessarily physically, is in there. So there's benefits to this organizational identification that we talk about. In an individual sense, if you're connected with an organization, it's a really good thing, it's doing well. You might have high self-esteem. It's good for you. You feel really good. You might also feel distinctive if you're part of an organization that's consistently doing wonderful things in the environment, and it's in Forbes lists about being one of the best organizations to work for, so on and so forth. You feel distinctive with that. There's identification benefits to being part of that organization. And also continuity of self-concept. So one of the things discussed earlier today was a look at how, and actually, Sheldon, it was you talking about it, the fact that when you're in a constant state of certainty, there's self-continuity. So your identification is continuous, and it helps you because you're certain. There's a benefit to that. So these are some benefits that individuals can draw on for organizational identification. On the alternative side, obviously organizations want to get some benefit from this. So there's long-term commitment. When employees or individuals who connect with your organization are identifying with it, they tend to be more committed to it. They're supporting it for a longer term. So this is the support that comes second. And then morale. So when you have employees that like the organization that they're a part of, they support it, they feel connected with its initiatives and what's going on, you end up with high morale, high productivity. It's a good thing for the organization. So you see that identity plays a part in organizations, and it benefits both the individual and the organization. So that's where it comes in terms of the importance. So on the alternative side, who am I not? So you've discussed who I am, right? I am this, I am that. But what about who you're not? What are you dissociating with? What is really not part of your identity? So think about that for a second, then say, I am not whatever it is. So I am not an extrovert, I am not an introvert, I am whatever. When you think of it from this way, identification has that contrast, that opposing side, the disidentification side. So organizational disidentification is a self-perception of separation from an organization. So in contrast to those organizations that you thought you really liked, right, or you really connected with, disidentification says, this is something that I really disagree with. And the main contributor to this research was Elsbach and Bhattacharya, which was one of the really fundamental papers in developing my arguments here. And they used the NRA, so the National Rifle Association in the United States, and it basically said that there's a strong disconnection of people's opinions about that organization. And people actually define themselves by saying, I'm not a redneck hillbilly NRA member, right? I'm completely opposite, I'm this. So they identify themselves by their opposition to an organization. So that's organizational disidentification. So it allows you to cognitively separate yourself from either organizations that you find are unremarkable, they just don't meet your needs or expectations, or that you actually disagree with in terms of their practices. So there's formal versus informal organizations. Essentially, all of the extant research that I talked about earlier has looked at formal organizations, so banks, large corporations, manufacturing, very traditional types of businesses, firms, those types of things. What the research hasn't talked about is collectives, so sort of the more informal types of organizations where identification processes are nonetheless important but haven't really been touched on. So that's a piece that I wanted to kind of build on with this project. So collective action is something that we've probably all heard about because it's becoming more prevalent in society. Occupy Wall Street is probably the one that comes to mind first and foremost. And that's basically the way in which social collectivism can really impact organizations. And so despite the fact that organizational identification and disidentification has been talked about in formal contexts, when we look at the importance of collectives, especially when we talk about social movements and challenger movements, there's relevance to those collectives and how identity plays a part in those. So that's where I've kind of said, okay, here's where we're missing some things, here's what people have said, where can we go from here? So my research question is then, how do issues of identity and emotion, so we talked about identity and we talked about the way that emotion in terms of your association or dissociation with organizations, how do those play a part? So how do issues of identity and emotion play out in the context of a collective? So a very high level research question, but nonetheless one that I think is going to address some of those questions that I had about the research that's been done so far. So my research setting, and this is where we tie into Diego's work, so the community gardens. So they are open spaces managed and operated by basically members of the community. So people come together, they have this common need of having a local space to grow food, or perhaps they want to make their neighborhood look better and grow flowers. And this is a real interesting example of a collective of individuals that come together for a variety of reasons, but nonetheless come together and kind of create their own organizations through community gardens. And there's been a lot of research, in particular, Kuchart 2012 has talked a lot about the kind of rise of community gardens and becoming more prevalent in society, but nonetheless hasn't talked about it in management, so I thought that was also another way to kind of introduce it. So specific context, in Kingston, so we're in Kingston, so there's some relevance here, that's good. There's 23 community gardens. For those of you who live here now, I would recommend that you go and you look at them, they're wonderful. But they're a diverse mix of physical attributes, they're in different geographical locations across the city. Those geographic locations also correspond to some different socioeconomic and demographic characteristics, which give me some variance in terms of the people that I can talk to for my project. So that brings me to my methodology. So what I did is use a qualitative research design, 10 semi-structured interviews, depth interviews in particular. And what that really allowed me to do was get at the depth and the detail of the ideas and the emotions and the identities of the individuals that were informants. So those informants were either coordinators or gardeners of these community gardens in Kingston, Ontario. And there was a diverse mix. Some of them were just coordinators who were paid to coordinate the garden. Others were coordinators and gardeners. Some were just gardeners. Others had been gardeners previously and were no longer. So there was a wide range of individuals that I was talking to, even within those 10 interviews. And then on top of that, to give me an idea of where I was going with the project to begin with, I looked at some archival text. So I looked at some newspaper articles, I looked at some blog posts, some social media posts from the organizations that deal with community gardens. And I said, okay, what's going on here? Where can I kind of dig in? And so that gave me a start. And then finally, observation. So when I could and when weather permitted, I actually conducted the interviews at the community gardens so people could kind of have, they call it auto-driving, so they recognize some of the emotions and experiences they have by actually being at the locations where they happen. So I thought that was kind of cool, and it's really just nice to go out and talk to people in a garden. There were some beautiful days, so I would recommend outdoor research if you can do it. Anyway, so my analysis. So I used a grounded theory approach. Obviously, coding I used in vivo, much the same as Sheldon did. And then in total, there were 248 pages of transcribed interview text. As John mentioned earlier, it is a large task to go through all of that, but nonetheless, I came up with some cool things. So findings. So here's where I get to the answers to my questions. So I am not, so this is that disidentification piece that we talked about, a gardener. This is a little counterintuitive because I'm talking to members of community gardens. Would you not think it's a little counterintuitive? Yes, we have a nod. That's good. People are still listening. So I am not a gardener. So I'm not a gardener, but the idea of gardening and growing your own food and all that kind of stuff does appeal to me. This was a woman who was instrumental in the creation of community gardens in Kingston. She helped start the application to the city. She helped develop them and grow them. And nonetheless, she doesn't consider herself a gardener. She's no longer a gardener. She kind of acts as an advisor now. But nonetheless, when I started to see this happening, I'm not a gardener, despite the fact that I was speaking with people who are gardeners, I thought this is an interesting thing to go about. Yeah?
What is a gardener?
What is a gardener? So that's a good question. And I guess that's kind of where I'm going. So and the paper talks about this, my suggestion is that the consideration of what a gardener is somebody who acts in the practice of gardening, somebody who participates in that practice, right? But that's not necessarily the case, as it turns out. So there's actually what I call simultaneity of identification and disidentification. So you may also identify with an organization, so you're a member of the garden, but at the same time you're disidentifying with its practice. So here, our last person was a coordinator, but she didn't consider herself a gardener, despite the fact that she was part of the other pieces of the organization. So she's both identifying and disidentifying with it. But there's multiple levels of self-concept. So the way I kind of got about this is that if you consider it at only one level, so one individual level, I am or I'm not a gardener, you might not get the fact that there's disidentification at other levels of your identity, what you consider to be identification with an organization. So there's personal identity and social identity, which we talked about to begin with, but there's also a third level. So this is the 3 levels of self-concept. And this was a Brewer and Gardner 96. They basically said there's an individual level, there's an interpersonal level, and there's a group level. So the individual level, you're considering your personal traits in comparison to others, and then your self-interest is really what's motivating you. At an interpersonal level, there's a relational aspect. So you're comparing yourselves directly to others based on your role with them. So it's a reflection of dyadic welfare. So how I'm actually benefiting others. And then there's a group level. So the collective is kind of your consideration set. You're looking at a group prototype. Am I the typical member of this group? And then you're comparing based on that prototype against other groups, and the goal here is collective welfare. So basically, what's happening is, although an individual may be a community garden member, because they consider themselves not to be good at gardening, they're disidentifying as a gardener. So at the individual level, I'm not a gardener, but I am a member of a community garden. Disidentification. At the interpersonal level, I like to be myself in the garden. I like to go out and enjoy myself. I don't really care to talk to other people, despite the fact that community gardens are designed in a communal basis. So interpersonal disidentification. And then at the group, part of community gardens is the communal aspect. People come together for work days. We share in a bunch of work that's kind of group oriented. You know, we weed the gardens. We plant a donation garden together. These type of things. But there are individuals who say, I don't want to do that. I just want to go out and I want to tend to my own garden. They're avoiding shared responsibility, so they're disidentifying with that organization. So how are they doing that? So this is happening through decoupling. So essentially, what individuals are doing is they're separating the formal structure of community gardens, so that communal aspect, the community aspects, from what they're actually participating in. So despite the fact that community gardens are intended to be communal and community-oriented, individuals are actually participating in a very individualistic way, which is allowing them to act in a way that's against what is typical of community gardens. So as a mechanism, essentially, decoupling was introduced in institutional theory that said, okay, organizations are really required to meet the external needs of legitimacy from external actors, but at the same time, by meeting those needs, they're actually reducing the practicality and they're becoming unable to operate. So by decoupling those two things, organizations can act in a way that's still practical for them, but they're still meeting those needs of the external stakeholders. And so as a mechanism at the individual level, individuals that are members of community gardens are disidentifying, are decoupling the aspects of those structures that they do not associate with, and as a result are able to still become a member and act as a member of that community garden. So I'm going to skip this and go here. So there's three real things happening. Identification. So we talked about identity at the beginning. Identification says that you are a member of the organization. You engage and associate with the practice and with the social group. These are the organizations that you like and that you agree with. Disidentification, on the other hand, is saying, I don't like the organization, I disagree with the practice, and I'm not a member of this social group. Simultaneous identification and disidentification is what's happening here in community gardens. So here, despite the fact that you are a member of that organization, a member of the community garden, you disidentify, you decouple with that practice and with that social group. And so instead of what previous literature has said about the fact that it's only one or the other, association, dissociation, identification or disidentification, it can in fact happen in both. Both can happen simultaneously. So 4 contributions. So first, previous research only talked about them as opposing constructs, never the same, never happening simultaneously. 2, decoupling. So at the individual level, in addition to at the institutional level, decoupling can be used as a mechanism for separating formal structure from activity. 3rd, the disidentification as an organizational member. So my research builds on Elsbach and Bhattacharya in 2 ways. One, it looks at being connected to an organization and disidentification happening through that. And additionally, one of their key constructs was the fact that the organization, the NRA, was very ideological and very polarized. Here, while there might be some ideological underpinnings to community gardening, in general, it's a much less polarizing organization. So as a result, this kind of gets at disidentification a little bit differently. And finally, levels of self-concept. So there's analysis through Brewer and Gardner's lens, which helps to look at identity instead of only at the individual or only at the group level. If you look at it at all 3 levels, you kind of get a more in-depth look at what identity in an organization actually entails. So implications, so basically, because organizational identification is important to both individuals and organizations, there's some impact in terms of how people deal with human resources, reputation and image management. So managers essentially want to deal with these types of issues. And then for research, so it's an examination of both identification and disidentification simultaneously, as opposed to, as I said, purely opposing constructs. And future research might benefit from looking at all three levels of self-concept, as I talked about, the personal, the interpersonal, as well as the group. So limitations, future directions, generalizability. Obviously, a study with 10 qualitative interviews has a limitation in terms of generalizability. So some large-scale testing could kind of look at some of these things in future research. And then saturation. So additional data collection could look at some other phenomena that are happening in this particular context. And then identity conceptualization. So I used social identity theory specifically, whereas it could have been looked at from other conceptualizations of identity. And looking through a different theoretical lens may in fact have benefited my project. So on that note, I'm all done. So thank you, and I guess we'll turn it over to Alex.